Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask a few other questions, but just want to comment. Representative Schaefer points to the privatization of higher education, which has become bloated, inaccessible, and unaffordable over the past half century, and I would hope we would never do the same thing to K through 12. I would also point out that the reason that was established is because there wasn't enough capacity in institutions of higher education to meet all students. That is not the case in K through 12 public education. I want to, Mr. Chambers, you brought up the long history of this fight in our state. You're aware that the Texas Declaration of Independence cites the Mexican government's failure to, quote, establish any public system of education, although possessed of almost boundless resources. That's in the Declaration of Independence for our state, signed by one of my ancestors. Is that your understanding?
It is.
And these voucher proposals have been brought before. In 1957, a tuition grant bill was passed through the House. It failed ultimately, but it was to allow kids to leave integrated schools and join white-only schools. You're familiar with that history?
I am.
Okay. Question for the current superintendents, Dr. Ott. As a local superintendent, do you decide how much state funding you receive?
No.
Who decides how much state funding you receive?
We're equalized, and so it depends on the local burden, and so the state does.
The state does? We do?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Are you aware that we are, as a state, 43rd in the nation in per pupil education funding?
I am aware, and I think that's why it's a bit perplexing that we want to be in the top 5 when we're not even in the, bottom 10 in funding.
Sure, and I should say, I think all of us would agree that Texas absolutely could be in the top 5. There's nothing our state, nothing our public schools can't do if they are given the resources. Do you believe that?
I absolutely believe that.
I do too. Do you decide what state regulations are placed on your schools or your educators?
No, and if I can take that door
Sure.
to address an excellent question by Representative Harrison and a point that Chairman Buckley brought up. When we start talking about ratings and CCMR, I do believe the devil's in the detail, and I want to give Representative Harrison a great example of that. As a school district, we graduated 576 students last year. 1C in the CCMR is career. We awarded 442 industry-level certifications last year. Now, I'm not counting my IB students that we send all over the place, Dartmouth, Georgia Tech. I'm not counting the number of students that made a 3 or higher in AP, and I'm certainly not counting the amount of students that are in our Air Force ROTC program. But if you just take those two numbers alone, that's 77%. Our CCMR rating was 51%, Representative Harrison. So to your point, I think the question is, how is it measured? Because if you're just looking at straight numbers, it doesn't make sense that we would have a B in CCMR when we had, just in one indicator alone, 76% of our students earned industry-level certifications. So that is very confusing to me. It's very confusing to the public. So the short answer is no, we don't have a say in or decision or even on how this stuff is designed in terms of regulations. And then the ratings that are assigned to us based on that are very inconsistent with a lot of pieces of data that our students are achieving.
And so you don't get to decide how much funding or resources you receive. You don't get to decide what state regulations you have to follow. Do you get to decide at least which students you get to serve?
No, and I think that's the other difference, too, is the idea of selective admissions. I understand that much about vouchers or tax credits or ed scholarships, whatever you want to call them from state to state, is really around the idea of parental choice. But at the end of the day, that choice does reside in the selective admissions process in non-public schools. It just does, rightly or wrongly. I mean, it's true. In public ed, we serve everyone every single student, no matter the disability, no matter the language barrier, no matter income level, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. And we are proud to do that.
And we're undoubtedly going to have some private schools that come testify and say they serve poor kids, they serve a diverse population. When I was a public school teacher in San Antonio ISD, all my students were black and brown, all of my students were economically disadvantaged. But even within those groups, there were students that came from supportive families. Mm-hmm. There were students who came with more advantages than others, even though they were all demographically the same. And you, as a public school district, cannot choose between those students and which ones you admit, which ones you serve, and which ones you don't.
Correct. And we cannot withdraw a student if there are an incident that happens or whatever. I mean, that's something we don't have a choice to do either.
Now, let's imagine for a second that you could do all those things. You could decide how much tuition to charge. You could decide which regulations to follow, and you could decide which students to serve. Do you think you would see higher achievement outcomes if you could control all three of those things?
I think so, based on the first couple things you mentioned, but the last, you're talking to the wrong person about picking and choosing students. We would serve all of them.
I appreciate that, and that's probably why you're in the job you're in. So if the legislature decides all those things, how much resources you have, what regulations you have to follow, or what you're burdened with, I'm trying to figure out why we would be creating lifeboats when we're the ones sinking the ship, right? So I guess my question is to any of you, can the legislature be the arsonist and the firefighter at the same time?
And I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that
That's
question,
okay.
but I do think it's a head scratcher to oppose the idea, or maybe not oppose, but I know there's some reservations about maybe assessments in non-public schools or certain regulations, but then there's a great deal of support for that in public schools. So I'm not sure I understand that dichotomy.
I have said many times from this dais that the most important job in the world is being a parent. And I have said that when I was a teacher, the most important partner, maybe the most important factor in my student success was the parent.
They are the first teacher.
Absolutely. And I'm, I think, the only member of the dais that doesn't have kids yet. But I live in Travis County, and I pay plenty of property taxes to support our local schools. In fact, 68% of Texas households don't have school-aged children, and they support these institutions. And we talked about the founding principles of our country. Maybe the founding principle was no taxation without representation. As a taxpayer who is paying for your public schools, a lot, I would say, what mechanisms do I have in your districts for representation and for accountability as a taxpayer without children in your schools?
So electing our board members or serving would be one. We have financial audit and accountability that we are required to share with the public. We also obviously have the academic accountability system as well. And then the first rating, which is the financial accountability rating. And then I think those are probably the most important pieces. And then anytime we have a community asking, whether it's a ratification election or a bond or anything like that, you have the opportunity to represent by vote of yes or vote of no on those pieces.
So as a taxpayer who doesn't have kids in school, and I'm paying a lot to support this enterprise of public education, I'm happy to do so. But in exchange, in order for you to take my hard-earned tax dollars, I get to vote in your school board elections for who's going to be making decisions in the school district. I vote on bonds. I can attend public school board hearings, and I could run for school board if I wanted to, correct, as a taxpayer, and be able to make decisions of what happens in this district. Those are all my avenues of representation. Do I have any of those if my tax dollars are sent to an unaccountable private school?
I can't answer that. I don't think so. And then there's also, I forgot to mention this, as a community member, you also have access to the grievance process in the school district. If there's something you disagree with, there's a specific policy section that addresses community members and grievance and due process. So that's another avenue I failed to mention.
Okay. Thank you all for being here.